Welcome back to the channel, guys. Exciting build on this episode. We've got a bookcase build that I'm going to be doing with you, but not just any bookcase, a secret door bookcase. These are a lot of fun, not as complicated as you think, but there are just some things you absolutely have to understand to execute something like this really well. So stay tuned, enjoy the ride. I'm going to walk you through in detail how to build a hidden bookcase on Rixson pivot hardware. All right, guys, it's time to put this bookcase together. It's going to be a little bit of a tricky assembly because the entire bookcase is going to be visible all the way around. I don't want to be using any exposed fasteners on the outside. I want to keep nail holes to the minimum. I don't want big screw heads and stuff like that. So I'm going to be using some pocket hole joinery. You see on here, I've got my Castle pocket holes on some of these where it will be concealed, but most of this stuff, I can't really use any screws. So what I'm gonna do is glue it as quickly as I can, and we're gonna clamp the whole thing together. I have all of my pieces pre-cut and all of my layout is done. This is stain grade. You can barely see my pencil lines on there. It's because I sanded over them so they're hardly visible at all because I don't want them to be visible through the stain later. But here we've got the shelves, and then over here I've got the shelves that will be going on the interior of the whole thing. They're kind of like floating shelves to match the other built-in that I have in the room. And then this is the back panel. Everything is edge banded. We'll fasten that directly on the back with glue. Also, because this is a hidden bookcase, this front edge, I did go ahead and edge band the front of this because it will be exposed also. The thing about kind of putting together stain grade cabinets is you kind of just have to be really careful with the glue, because if you end up with squeeze out and you get that on your wood, you can't really sand it out in these really tight nooks and crannies, and it will cause your stain not to take well, obviously. So I'm gonna try and glue everything up, but definitely I'm gonna be very cautious and not get too liberal with the amount of glue that I'm using here. You do really kind of have to be mindful of the order that you're putting your parts together in. There is kind of a rhyme or reason to how I'm doing this. Trying to put parts together in a way that I can still access pocket holes but keep them hidden. So like I have two pieces going on right here, but obviously I want to be able to get both sides screwed on this bottom piece first before I put the next piece in. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Now this right here is what I was kind of talking about with the order of operations. I wanted to be able to get this screwed in from both sides before I put this next panel on the bottom. The reason there's two panels here is because I'm gonna have a piece of 1x going across the bottom that'll cover both of these, so I needed something top and bottom to fasten that piece of 1x into. At this point, I've got the bulk of the bookshelf assembled. The nice thing with using more floating style shelves, they're larger and the cuts are square, so it kind of helps square everything up. But as I assembled this, obviously trying to use just the right amount of glue and then putting clamps on the top here to get this pulled together to make a really nice strong glue joint. The other thing that I have done right now is you'll notice how I've got this positioned on my workbench. I pulled it nice and square, so I'm essentially using my workbench to help ensure that the whole thing is square and that it's not racked in a bad way. From here, the next step is going to be to put the back panel on it, but I'm just gonna give it a little bit of time to let this glue set up on these shelves. I do also have, obviously, the pocket hole screws on the top and bottom areas to help hold things together as well. But it's very important for this style of bookshelf, it has to be extremely strong because it's got to resist any kind of racking that might happen because it's all going to be swinging on one corner pivot at the corner of the bookcase. You will notice up here at the very top of the bookcase, I've got 2 pieces of plywood, and that's because the pivot hardware that I'm going to put on that corner will actually mortise deeper than 3/4 of an inch. So I doubled up the plywood here so that you wouldn't see that mortise going all the way through. Ideally, building something like this, I would like to be able to screw into these shelves the whole way to make it super strong. But again, stained grade white oak, I don't want all those exposed fasteners, so I've just used brad nails to tack it in place, and then we're using the glue and the clamps just for our final strength and assembly here. One thing to note, while you're working with white oak, your fingers will turn a blackish purple color. That's from the tannins in the wood. And it seems like the longer you work with it, the darker your fingers get, but the oils in your hands start to collect dirt and dust, and it's actually really easy to get just dark smudges all over this wood. So it's nice, keep washing your hands occasionally whenever you're handling this stuff, just to try to keep the smudging to as much of a minimum as possible. Hands are somewhat clean, and it's time to put on the back panel. So you can see on the back, maybe ever so lightly, I've marked pencil lines in the center of the plywood on these shelves so that I can fasten it. We're going to flip this thing over, glue it, and get this back panel on. From a strength perspective, this next part is the most important part of this build. This back panel is the cornerstone of everything. The back panel is going to be what prevents the bookcase from being able to rack. Again, this whole thing is going to be swinging on one center point. So all the weight on the bookcase is going to want to make this thing rack, and this back panel on the back is going to be what resists that and keeps everything nice and square. So we're going to put a decent amount of glue all the way around this and very carefully get this back panel secured on here, and that should make us have a really strong bookcase that'll function well for this hidden door. Time for the fun part now. We are going to try and get this back panel positioned in place without smearing glue all over it. So, got the bottom identified. Basically, we're going to do this just like you would if you were doing a laminate countertop with contact cement. I've got this sticker in place right there, so it's keeping my back panel out of the glue. We're going to get it all squared up very, very close to where it should be. And then I'm going to pull this thing out. Then very carefully set it down. Looks pretty good. May even go ahead and put a nail in it just so it doesn't move. Try that. Same thing up top here. We'll give it a lift, pull the sticker out, carefully set it down so that we're not smearing any glue. That looks pretty good also. Obviously, with this back panel on, we want to make sure we're squaring up the whole bookcase. So to do that, we're going to start with 2 points here. I already tacked this corner, so the bottom is nice and flush here. The next thing I'm going to come and do is go over to this outside piece of plywood, and I'm going to flush the bottom up here as well and put a nail in that. Now we'll move up here to the top corner, and we want to get it so that it's in position exactly where it should be so that everything is nice and square. Really is going together pretty well. Happy with that. So now I'll tack, that didn't go. tack both of these corners here. I know I said I wanted to avoid as many exposed fasteners as possible, but I really want to secure this back panel well. So I am going to put some staples in the back and then fill those holes. I think it'll be just fine. No, it's not ideal necessarily, but I want to make sure that this back panel is sucked up tight against our shelves here. Even though I have it squared up with the corners, I've still got a little bit of a bow in the actual bookshelf. It's not quite even. So we'll use some clamps here to get that pulled into place so that our bookshelf is nice and flush with our back panel. We're all glued up here. I've got a nice amount of clamps around the perimeter, and then I've got 2 crown staples per shelf kind of going down this center area into my floating shelves. I'm gonna give this a little time to set up just to ensure that it's just gonna be the absolute strongest that it can be. Basically, I'm using these clamps because I didn't want to pepper the whole back side of this with staples all the way around the back, being that it is stained grade white oak. This will be the bottom, so those won't be exposed. You will notice on here, this back panel, I did edge band this outside edge so that it would take stain nicely. I'll give it a little bit of a sanding, obviously, where we've got any glue squeeze out, but that should look really good stained up. You're not gonna really see the inside of this bookcase very much. It's going to be in a kind of a closet hidden area, but still want to do as good a job as possible on it. So went the extra mile and edge banded that. I did just realize a little bit ago I made a bit of a screw up. Whenever you make shop drawings, you shouldn't change them on the fly because the drawings worked on the computer, and whenever you change something on the fly, inevitably you're failing to realize something that it's not going to work. I had the depth on these sides at 8 inches, and this morning I decided I wanted them a little bit deeper at 9 inches. Well, then adding 3/4 in the back, that's 9 3/4. The 1x10 material that I had figured for my jamb is no longer gonna work. So that kind of screws things up, means tomorrow morning I'm gonna have to acquire some 1x12. I don't really wanna mess with gluing up this stuff. So just another delay I have to figure out. Alrighty, it is a new day, exciting stuff. Started off by running up to the job site this morning, had to do some stuff there, got some 1x12 on the way back home, and went ahead and popped the clamps off this thing. It is feeling extremely stiff and rigid, which is what we want. So getting a good glue joint all the way around this with clamping pressure definitely made it extra strong. Gave it a quick sand, so now we just need to move on to our jambs and mortise in our pivot hardware, and basically this will be ready to go to the job site. Before we move on, I will point out everything is extra crispy as usual. Everything came together really well. I was a little concerned with clamping it up that we might have some glue squeeze out on the inside, but I don't see any at all, so I'm very pleased with that. You will notice the front edge here, edge banding looks excellent. And then on our 3/4 inch back panel here, edge banding also. So we've got a really nice look all the way around. Haven't discussed this detail yet, but you really can't hardly tell. But this side right here is actually an 1/8 inch narrower than this side. And that is going to help with the pivot function. So you can very lightly see that this is beveled right here. And that'll help with our clearances as this opens and closes. And then this plywood edge right here is actually beveled at about 10 degrees or so. I have my jamb legs ripped, and then the top jamb is right here. We're getting ready to install the Rixson pivot hardware. I want to go over the basics on how to design a hidden door. I've found this process to be very efficient and accurate and effective for me. You'll notice here I'm in my SKETCHUP model. I've got a print of the room we're going to be working in created. This was all framing dimensions whenever I was designing this. And then I also have a face elevation of the wall where I'll be installing this. This would represent the rough opening right here. And then you'll see the jamb I have drawn in there. I like to start with the top view. I'll go ahead and take my rough opening, and you'll notice here I have the wall, drywall thickness added in, 1/2 inch, and then I've got 3/4 inch nickel gap added in as well right there. So that is accounted for. I also have on this back side here an area where I'll be furring this out to match the depth of my bookshelf. You'll see I've got casing drawn in. And the starting point where I like to start is with the jamb. So I gave myself a 1/4 inch of clearance between the wall, which is right here on the left, my space, which is lit up right there, and then my jamb, which is right here. From there, we can begin drawing in our bookcase carcass parts. Now this is the secret sauce for designing a bookcase with pivot hardware. You'll see this crosshair right here. That represents my pivot point. So I can draw in my desired bookcase. I can select my pivot point, and then I can rotate this in SKETCHUP and check my clearances to ensure that I am not going to hit on the sides of my jamb, so I can maximize the size of my bookcase while ensuring that I have the proper clearances all around. I'm basically looking for my clearances on this upper right side, which is the back corner, the front portion here where my mouse cursor is, and then as this opens here on the left side as well. So I can just hit the Q for the rotate function here for this component, and I'm watching that those edges, everything looks good. So from here with a top view in 2D, I can begin building up from that. As we keep moving forward in this video, there's a key dimension I will be referencing a lot, and that is from the inside of this jamb to my pivot point. And you'll see right there that is 2 inches. That is an extremely, extremely important dimension. Maintaining that is critical. Now, if I'm hitting somewhere, I can move my pivot point around. So I can actually move it forward here. I'll get out of the component so I can select the whole component, select my pivot point again, and I can rotate. Now you see just by moving that pivot point how bad we've messed everything up. We're making huge contact on the side, so obviously that pivot point does not work. We'll move it back, and again, you can see that this works with all of these key areas. After we're done with our top view, we can move on to getting a front elevation. This is the jamb that I built, and I actually had the bookcase drawn in here, but I moved it up and converted it into 3D. So as you'll see here, I've got the 3D model of the bookcase created. If we come around here to the back side, you'll see the inside view of my jamb. I don't have casing drawn in here yet, but this is what the inside will look like. Now, you'll notice down here, I have my pivot point here. So in 3D, I can go, oh, I didn't select my component first. I can go ahead and rotate this whole thing open and just kind of see what it looks like. I can see how it works. See if I can manage to navigate this here. Moving around the back side here, you'll see how it opens. It'll open all the way to the wall, and that looks good. So, using Rixson pivot hardware, we can identify an exact pivot point, and we can create a model that ensures that we can move our bookcase or hidden door open and close without any issues. In case you're not familiar with Rixson pivot hardware, it's high quality hardware, and the reason I like it is because it's extremely strong and it's going to maintain tolerances over a long period of time if you do it correctly, whereas more of a traditional hinge type application could potentially sag or lose some adjustability, so on and so forth. And essentially what we have here, This piece is going to go on our floor, and then this piece will mount on the underside of our bookshelf, and the whole thing will pivot on here like so. Really high quality ball bearing in here, so once it's installed, it's going to stay exactly where it should be. Now on the top, we've got two pieces. This guy right here will install in the top of our bookcase, and it matches up with this piece here, which will go in the top jamb. Now the way this works, there's a pin right here, and it drops down. And we drop that pin down by rotating this set screw right here. So as you'll see, that pin is dropping down. It receives into this piece here, and the whole thing rotates like so. So it's a really excellent hinge mechanism for a hidden bookcase scenario like this. If you are designing a hidden bookcase, you can pull all the specs off of the internet. You can basically get this sheet, and that's what I did as I drew up my plans in SKETCHUP for this hidden door. Now what you see right here is a top view of a section of the bookcase, and this crosshair right here is what I determined was the pivot point that I wanted. And I determined that by testing this on the computer in SKETCHUP to make sure all my clearances were going to be good. So to that pivot point, I've got these dimensions both for the bookcase and from the outside of my jamb. You'll see here, I've went ahead and I've marked that center point where my pivot is going to be. Essentially, that is that piece right there. So looking at our top jamb, the dimension is 2 3/4 over. So I measured 2 3/4 over. That's the center of my pivot point. 7/8 up is the center line here. And essentially what that is for this piece right here. And as you'll see, that center line is lining up with the center of my pivot mechanism right here. Now, as far as mortising this goes, I've made a variety of jigs because I do this type of hardware installation quite a bit. So this is just a flush jig. It's going to work really well. It will use a flush bearing right there, which I can see is not going to work. I'm going to have to get a different bit out to make that work because the bearing is under the base right here. So I'll address that in a second. I also took the time a while back to make a bunch of templates that match all of the different pieces of hardware for the Rixson pivot hinges, but this all uses a 1/2 inch bit and a 5/8 collar. Honestly, I kind of like to just use a flush template, and the reason is I can just mark my lines, and I can mark the center on the underside here, and then all I've got to do is just drop this exactly on top of my pencil lines, and I don't have to account for that 1/16 inch offset all the way around, and I kind of just find a flush template is easier. Something I highly recommend is having a variety of router bits. This is the one I just put back here. I'm going to downsize it slightly. That guy right there is what we're going to want. Now to set the depth for the mortise, very simple. I'm just going to take my template, I'm going to set it on top, and I'm going to take my piece of hardware and set it across the top here. And I'm just going to adjust this down until the top of my bit is just a little higher than the top of my hardware right here. And of course, keep in mind we're wanting a bit that will give us the depth that we want, but also will have the bearing writing on our template. I actually could have even used a bit that was a little bit shorter for this. Changed my mind, I'm actually going to take this bit out because I don't want to potentially ruin my template by having too large of a cutter on here. Having a cutter that's just the depth that you need will help kind of reduce your risk of damaging your template as you're routing. You can see how fast this goes. It's really not a big deal at all. getting a router set up like this. Took maybe 60 seconds to switch that out. And now you can see here that our guide bearing is riding up a lot higher on the template. Less cutter, less chance of damaging my template. Now getting started, very simple. I do have a center line marked on my template here, which helps in lining it up. I've got my marks on the outside here representing the outside of my hardware. I've got my center line here. So all I've got to do is carefully position this in place so that I'm covering those marks, and I've got everything equally covering over those pencil marks, I guess you would say. And then all I do is just take a pin nailer, two pin nails both sides will secure it, and then it's easy just to pop it off after we're done. Obviously the corners on this are square, so something that actually can make it a little bit easier to square up your corners after you do your routing is to leave the template on, and then the template itself will kind of help to keep your chisel in that vertical square position while you square up your corners. Now we'll just pop our template off there. You can see my pin nails are stuck in the template. Really easy just to bend those over. They break right off and you're ready to use your template again on your next project. This particular piece of hardware is funky because we need to cut out for this cylinder here as well as this long section and little holes for this stuff here. So it takes a little bit more time. I'm going to do that next. My mortise is 1.25 inches wide here, but I'm just going to use a 1/2 inch gauge block and mark it from both sides just to help me eyeball where my center line is going to be, and then also give me a reference point on cutting for this shaft. Give you a closer peek here. That's what we end up with to get this top piece to fit in there. That looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and use the center drill bit to get those holes started. That way we don't have any splitting or anything like that. The screws that they provide are quite large and a bit long, but I'm gonna go ahead and use them anyways. The holes on the end are actually for a little bit slightly smaller screw. Very important to pre-drill these holes. We don't want this splitting. Freaking, wow. You know, that whole time I was thinking to myself, like, that's just not a big enough hole. I shouldn't be doing this. I should have drilled a bigger hole, and that's exactly what happened. So do as I say, not as I do. I'll put some glue in this, clamp it up, it'll be fine. Just annoying and unnecessary. Should have used a bigger bit to pre-drill those holes. Little trick here, whenever you have something like this and you're trying to repair it, and you need to get glue down in there as best as possible, you can use air to force that glue down through that crack to make sure you've got coverage over the whole thing. Basically, you're done whenever you see that glue coming through the bottom, which I do here. I'm actually gonna put a little on the bottom here. Go ahead and finish drilling here with an appropriately sized bit, trying to select the right size bit. You want to line it up there with the shaft or the cylinder on the screw, not the threads, and that'll be about the correct size. Now they do provide a cover plate that can be put over the top, and I'll install this after paint. But I make the main piece basically just flush with the wood to a little bit in. The cover plate is slightly oversized, and I don't want to mess with doing a double mortise in order to get this cover plate flush. So I just make it so that the cover plate will sit right on top, and then we'll fasten it with these 2 screws here. Went ahead and took my clamp off for a second here just to get my jamb legs fastened on here. I'm gonna just put some crown staples through here, and then I'm also gonna go ahead and put some drywall screws through. It's very important that this whole head jamb stay very securely secured in the opening and doesn't move, so we want this to be fastened together really well. And I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of what I call stretchers across here just to help keep everything together during transport. New tool I've absolutely been loving, the M12 18 gauge brad nailer from Milwaukee. Shoots up to 1.5 inch nails, but it has been awesome to have on the workbench. Just the perfect size as a cordless nailer at the workbench. Something to watch out for and be mindful of whenever you're routing this top jamb is that as you're looking at the jamb face down, it's really easy to get the orientation switched around as far as what corner you should be routing in. I've made the mistake multiple times of routing it on the wrong side of that top jamb. In this case, the bookcase is going to be swinging in like this, so I've got it in the right spot, but it's very easy to put it in the wrong area. Next up, we are going to need to mount our hardware on the bookcase. So it's going to be easiest to get this thing down flat on the workbench to do that. Moving on to our top piece here. Again, I've got my pivot point marked. I've got the width of the piece that I'm installing marked. I just went ahead and got my depth set correctly for this piece, double checking measurements, making sure everything looks right, making sure the pivot point looks right. And again, we've got the center points on our template. We'll go ahead and pop this guy on there and we can route it. Again, I am getting my pivot point from my SKETCHUP drawing. So here again, this was from the outside of the jamb to the pivot point up here. Now we're onto the actual bookcase, outside of the bookcase to the pivot point, 1 3/8 and then 7/8 of an inch in. Triple checking, making sure I'm routing on the correct corner of the bookcase. We're good to go. By the way, the hole that I drilled for that cylinder to be able to fit was 1 1/8 inch. And again, I doubled up this plywood to 1.5 inches to accommodate the depth of that. 3/4 of an inch wouldn't have been enough. It was right at 3/4. So we'll just go ahead and permanently fasten this. I had to use a couple of my own wood screws because the screws provided we're a bit longer than 1.5 inches. So that's in there nice. Something I'll note is that the whole time I've been mortising this hardware, I've been using the same combination square set at 7/8 of an inch to mark my pivot point on all of my different locations. The consistency of using this is going to help ensure that I'm in the exact same spot on each different piece of this puzzle. Now we're moving down here to the bottom pivot point of the bookcase. Again, using this combination square to mark my center line. I'm going to measure over 1 3/8 inches because that is where my pivot point is at according to my shop drawings that I made. I'll go ahead and carefully square this up. Now on this bottom piece, I am actually just going to face mount it. I'm actually not doing a mortise on this one. Just didn't really feel it was necessary in this particular situation. Sometimes on doors, I do, actually almost all the time on doors, I do mortise it. And note, you will need, if you're doing a hidden door with pivot hardware, the door needs to be 1 3/4 inches thick because this part is 1.5 inches wide. So here's my bottom pivot point. It's going to be for this piece of hardware. I want to draw your attention to one key spec on here. For this Rixson 370 pivot hardware, I ran into this a number of times. It specifies minimum pivot point is 2 inches. And basically I take that to mean the minimum pivot point is 2 inches from the inside of your jamb to the center of the pivot. You'll notice right here I've got 2 3/4 inches. My pivot point is actually 1 7/8 inches, which is absolutely pushing the limits. Part of the reason I'm able to achieve that, hopefully in this case, is because I beveled this part of the bookcase here back so that it's going to clear a little bit better. But you really have to watch that. You can't, I just recommend that you do not go under that 2-inch specification from the inside of your jamb to the pivot point or it won't work probably. And you'll also notice the dimension for this piece of hardware from my center line of the pivot to the outside is 1 3/8 inches. And that's actually exactly what I have right here. So my hardware is actually going to be right up against the outside of my bookcase. Now this is our central pivot mechanism and this will mount to the floor and the whole thing will pivot on this right here. So in my drawings I planned on not mortising this. So I'm just going to double check everything right now and ensure that we're looking good with what I had planned so that we don't run into any issues. You can see right here I've got 1 7/16 inches, maybe just 1 7/16 inches, a little bit strong. And if we come over here to the drawing, I used this measurement in the specs, 1 7/16 inches from the top of that bracket to the top of our flooring. So we should be good to go. Now this is something that I've done in the past that's worked out pretty well, just as far as job flow and order of operations. We need this bottom bracket to sit on top of our finished floor. And I know that my finished floor is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. So what I've done in the past, and I'm going to do this time as well, is I'm going to go ahead and make a block 3/4 inches thick. That way I can shim up this bottom metal bracket what I need it to be and just permanently install it. I don't want to have to try to find this pivot point and reinstall this bracket after flooring. I just want to do it now, and the flooring guys will cut their flooring around my bracket here. So I've got some JB weld, just 5-minute epoxy mixed up here, and what I do is just smear it all over this block really good, just to give me a really good bond to my bracket. And then I'll go ahead and set this bracket on here. Get it pressed in there nice and firm. And I'm just going to set this aside somewhere where it's not going to get touched until that epoxy sets up. And then whenever we're on site tomorrow, we can just pre-drill through this and install it right to the floor. I can tell that it's just sitting here, it like wandered. So that ain't gonna work unless I just keep moving it as this stuff sets up. So I think I'm just gonna put a couple clamps on here, just barely touching, so that I don't end up epoxying my clamps to this thing, just to help keep it centered until it sets up. There we go. JB Weld, super handy to have in the shop. I try to always have some on hand. It's great for repairing stuff and all kinds of miscellaneous tasks. At this point, we are ready to load this stuff up and head to the job site for install. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for me to be able to draw these designs up in SKETCHUP so I can actually ensure that all of the pivot points are going to allow things to clear, that we're not going to have any binding and stuff like that. So fingers crossed that we can get this installed without any issues and we didn't miss anything. It's always a little bit scary doing these hidden doors. All right, guys, back on site here, and I've got this bookcase tacked in place. I wanted to make sure that everything fit and worked exactly like it should. Real quick here first, but I'm going to show you how to go about the process of installing this bookcase in the trim to get great results. Just a little bit of context here first. We're in what is going to be a study office space here in this custom home. As you can see, we've got a ton of nickel gap on the walls. Going down here, got a circular staircase, come up the stairs to a glass white oak door. Then walking in here, white oak beams, nickel gap on all the walls and ceiling. Got a built-in there I did, still need to finish up the trim around it. And then over here, we'll have our hidden bookcase room and then another matching built-in over here, so it'll be pretty cool. You'll notice here I've got the trim, the casing, which is gonna match the rest of the house tacked in place. I made that out of white oak. And then down here, you'll see the pivot mechanism on the bottom. We've got it up here on the top, and you can notice the clearances as this closes. We're good on the side, good over here on this side, about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch to spare there. And then you'll notice over here how it closes and disappears on that side as well. So everything is working exactly as it should, exactly as it was designed, which is always a good thing. The one problem I did have, I failed to foresee, was getting the pin mechanism up here to drop in place. There's a set screw right there that you need to access because I can only open the bookcase this far because of this wall. I couldn't access that screw, so I did have to put a 1/2 inch hole right there. That way I can put the screwdriver up through that to raise and lower this pin to mount this bookcase. Let's see how fast I can disassemble this whole thing. This casing was just tacked in place with a couple brads. And then all we have to do is raise this pin and we can take the whole bookcase right off. So let's talk order of operations here. I had this jamb pre-built in the shop, so all I had to do was install it first. And then you'll get your bottom pivot point based off of this top pivot point. We'll plumb down to get that. But the first thing I did was I made sure this nickel gap that we put on the walls was all plumb. and that this whole opening was in plane. We don't want it to be cross-legged. That's gonna make it very difficult to make this look right. So I ensured that everything was nice and plumb and in plane. Had to shim out this nickel gap on this side, about 1/8 to 3/16 going down here to make that happen. Wasn't really a big deal. As you start installing your jamb, the most important part of this installation is the head piece. All of the weight of the bookcase is going to be on this pivot point and down here on this pivot point. So we want to absolutely lock in this head jamb so that it cannot move at all. So very important to get shims in very tight on both ends. You'll notice here, if we take our 360 laser, I love this laser from Milwaukee, and check the whole door to see if it is in plane, you'll notice that laser beam is just touching that outside edge all the way around. That means that it's plumb and it's in plane and it's not cross-legged, and that's what you want for a door situation like this. Obviously this jamb is wider than the wall assembly that we had here. I've got about another 2 1/4 inches that the jamb sticks out past the drywall. I'm gonna fur this whole wall out, and then we'll drywall it so that it's flush on the inside here. And then we'll also move this switch over and then install casing around the inside of this opening a little bit later on. So next, let's take a look at what it takes to install that lower pivot point. We've got our jamb shimmed all the way around. It's in plane. Pretend that is not there yet. How do we install that? Well, first off, I want to draw attention again. These are the specs on the Rixson 370 hardware. You remember earlier in the video, I mentioned where it says minimum pivot point is 2 inches. Why is that important? You'll notice right here, this bracket is exactly 2 inches away from the jamb to that pivot point. So if I would have been any closer than that, it might not have worked, number one, but I also would have had to cut something here to make this work. So make sure you're staying 2 inches back at your pivot point for that reason. I also know from my own drawing that my pivot point is 7/8 of an inch in from the back of the bookcase, which is also the same as the back of my jamb here. So what I did was I went up here, and I still have the marks from mortising this piece in, 7/8 of an inch in. Made another mark over here, 7/8 of an inch in, and then we'll move our laser so that it's in plane with these pencil marks. Okay, so now I've repositioned the laser so that it is 7/8 of an inch in, and it is, if I can block it there, it is right on my pencil line there. And on the pencil line over here, it's also in line with our pin that's gonna drop down. And so now we can locate this bottom bracket. And I knew, based off of my dimensions, that it was gonna be 2 inches in. And then I have it 7/8 of an inch in, which all from this jamb, which also aligns with my laser perfectly. I will note, when I screwed this in, I only screwed it in with 2 screws right now, just in case I needed to move something. At this point, I know the bookcase works with these 2 screws, so I can put these other 2 screws in now at this point also. You'll also notice on our block here, this is a 3/4 inch block. Our hardwood flooring installer will install the hardwood flooring right up to this. That way we don't have to remove it and reinstall it on top of the flooring. They'll install right up to it. And again, remember that we epoxied this piece on top of this block. It makes it easier to install. Alrighty, this is the less glamorous side of carpentry. Just furring out this wall. Got some framing material in there. Went ahead and cut out this drywall. Moved this switch over 3 inches. Drywall is in. We'll get the drywaller back here. He's been back quite often on this job. So the next thing we'll do is put the bookcase into position. It's really simple. You just put the bottom pivot in there first. And then again, this set screw here drops this pin right here. Now there is a cool little trick. If you get this just right, at the just right height, you can push this up, push your bookcase in, and then this will actually drop down into the hole. So that makes it a lot easier to get it in place if you kind of do that just right, rather than having to try and screw this down and hold it in place at the same time. The main thing I'm going to try to do is not drag the plywood edges across this floor any more than I have to so that it doesn't splinter out. So I'm going to drag it on that metal piece that's on the bottom. And from this point, it's pretty easy to get into place. We're just going to rock it over the top here. And I can already tell it's going to have to go in. So there we are. Bottom's in place. This is what I'm talking about again. If you get that set just right, you can push, I can't do it one-handed, but you can push the bookcase in place and that pin will drop down into the hole that is on the top of the door right there. Now that's locked firmly in place. That's all there is to it. It's really actually pretty simple. So that closes up there. Now all we've got to do is put the frame around it. There'll be a piece we'll put on the bottom here, and that's about it. Well, normally I don't like to use PL Premium on things unless it's absolutely necessary, but here I've only got about 1.5 inches of this casing that is actually going to overlap right here, so I want it to be strong and stiff. So I am going to go ahead and put PL around this frame just to ensure that if somebody really throws this closed, it's not going to get damaged and come off the wall. Well guys, that's it for this build. I am extremely happy with how this came together. Everything is functioning really well. You will notice on the bottom here, I did add this piece of 1x8 planed down to about 5/8. This is the only piece of trim that is not lapping. It's butted together, which means it's going to need to be back cut a little bit in order to swing freely. So as you see right there, that opens and closes nicely. If you look over here, this one will butt up to that piece of casing pretty much nice and tight. However, for this one to function, I have to back cut this casing right here so that it can actually swing in. Because of the pivot, it would actually bind on this casing. The only way to open it without back cutting the casing would be to keep this back probably a strong 1/16 of an inch, maybe even an 1/8, which would look terrible. So the best way to handle this is to back cut the casing precisely. But then once you actually step back, you really cannot see it at all. And it's even better whenever it's stain grade because it conceals much better than if it was painted. Painted stuff is always caulked and seamless. So stain grade is actually more forgiving whenever you do hidden doors like this. So everything is functioning really well. See if we go on the inside here, we're nice and tight the whole way because we are on plane the whole way. You'll notice we'll use a button cap on this hole right here because we will have to be able to access that hole to get to this set screw to actually take the door off down the road. The only other thing I wanted to mention that I really didn't talk about a lot was that I kept this whole piece back cut about 1/8 of an inch and beveled, and you can just see it. This whole thing goes in, and what that does is it allows me to pivot behind here without contacting the casing. So if we do get in nice and tight right here, you will notice I'm closed, but that side of the bookcase is actually back off of the casing a little bit. But then if we move up here, you'll notice across the top, I am tight the whole way. And that is because I did that bevel detail on there to keep it back. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but this, from about this point in, that bevels, my edge banding even follows right over the top of that bevel. But that allows it to have a nice clearance as it opens and closes. You can see there, I've got about 1/16 of an inch from contacting the casing, and that's what we want. Whenever we do these, we don't want to make our margins so tight that if something moves or expands and contracts, that it's going to bind up. We want to design these so that there's a level of forgiveness as things open and close. So I'm really happy with this. I think it's excellent how it's all. Some of you might be wondering, what about a latch mechanism for locking it? You can do all kinds of fancy stuff. On this particular application, we're just going to end up using magnets. Reason being, if you have a latch, you could potentially lock somebody inside. A kid could lock themselves inside. A kid could lock another kid inside, and we don't want that. So here we're just going to use magnets, and there won't be any active latch mechanism on this. One final peek inside. It is dark in here, so you can't see really well, but this will finish out nicely still. We'll get that mudded up, and then we'll put casing on the inside of here. And again, I did edge band this back panel, so the back of the bookcase is actually going to look nice. It'll stain up good. I think this just executed extremely well. So very happy with it. Hope you enjoyed the build. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, signing off. We'll see you on the next video.